I'm mostly talking about the period before Captain Barclay. This is because I've always had a problem with the captain. For the aspiring historian of early pedestrianism, he stands as a great barrier, a rock of Gibraltar that tends to obscure everything behind him or around him, which is understandable. If you get two full-scale biographies within 2 centuries, you're obviously a big name. Did he obscure stuff that we ought to know about? Well, make up your own mind in a moment. We can blame him, it's not his fault, but we can blame him for various narratives. The first narrative is that he was the first gentleman amateur, and that he essentially gave rise to the posh boy amateurs of the mid-19th century. And here are some local ones from 1879 with their chariots of fire ideology. Another alternative for early pedestrianism is that, in fact, it came up from the grassroots, from fairs and wakes and celebrations, and is derived from all sorts of rather ad hoc races for men and women, if you don't know about it. And that narrative continues that pub landlords then started sponsoring races on ground beside the pub, and that in the fullness of time gave rise to running grounds, which in turn gave rise to modern athletic stadiums, or stadia. Let's go back and see the hidden bit behind Captain Barclay. From about the 17th century, if you were a rich aristocrat or member of the gentry, you might well have a running footman who ran ahead of your coach and or delivered your letters. Some employers used their running footmen as I say, cheaper than a racehorse, and we're now beginning to get names of these individual running footmen. Musgrave, Butler, Groves, Mawborn. We're beginning to find out something about them. The next thing we discover, early 18th century, is it's said, the assumption is there were no enclosed grounds with measured running courses. In fact, there were. Belsize House, by 1720, was having running events on a measured course. We've already identified over 30 events divided between races for prizes of up to 6 guineas, say 1,000 quid, and head-to-head challenges for wagers, the sort of thing that historians of the 19th century are familiar with. We can even begin to trace some of these aristocratic running footmen who continued into this more professional, self-employed running arena. There was a second, after Belsize closed, we can identify a second enclosure where races took place, running races. It's still there, as you can see, in Finsbury, and there's a similar pattern of sponsored races to bring in the punters at tuppence a time, and they also hosted head-to-head pedestrian contests of the sort that, as I say, we're familiar with from the 19th century, later in the So in the 18th century, we did have professional athletes. Another topic, before Captain Barclay, we also had amateur long-distance walkers. Barclay may have walked 1,000 miles in 1,000 hours, which he did, but Foster Powell was as good a walker 30 years before that, 40 years before that. Long-distance walking was so popular that Astley, the great impresario of the period, was able to sell tickets to come and watch this man walk around the stage and have a mock coronation. So Captain Barclay wasn't the first great long-distance walker with national acclaim. Barclay's biographer says that in the last third of the 18th century, long-distance pedestrianism was invented by the men of power and influence and repute, the gentlemen. This is one of them from locally. He doesn't look very gentlemanly to me, but he was, I guess, just in that category. Captain Barclay's class, if you like, very, very quickly gave way. The rot set in almost immediately. By 1815, you had very working class, money-orientated pedestrian walkers, again so nationally famous that they get their pictures nationally circulated. They're not quite gentlemen, as you can see. He's just pretending he was a baker, he was in trade. They were financed by wagers, by pub and pleasure garden sponsorship, and, this is a very rare handbill from Rochester, sometimes by the local gentry subscribing money to watch these men walk for 6 weeks on end, non-stop. That's as much as I've done. The next thing I have to do is look at the later bit of the 18th century and the professional runners. I'm going to have a look next at northern runners on northern racecourses, which haven't had the attention they deserve. But I'm so exhausted I can't start now. So that's the 18th century.
Time, that was perfect. So we have time for just one or two quick questions. Sure.
It's really interesting, especially the bit about running footmen.
Yes.
Struck me. I was wondering if you have any evidence that this kind of practice was also given under the aristocracy in other European countries, or is it something?
Interestingly, possibly, because one of the running footmen I mentioned, but it went past so quickly you won't remember it, a bloke called William Mawbone. There was a report in 1730-ish that he had been headhunted by Louis XV of France to come and run for him. So it implies, possibly, yes.
Yeah.
And there is one other running footman contest later in the 1730s where there's an English running footman against a footman employed by the London-based ambassador of the Holy Roman Empire with a foreign name, German, I suspect. So here's a German ambassador possibly bringing a running man across to England. So yes, I think there must be stuff to be investigated there. Yeah.
One more? Dave?
We know the later enclosed grounds from Samsworth were doing things like hair coursing and lots of different events. Did Belsize Park, was there a range of events there?
They did what's called Galloway races, which are ponies, I think, small horses. They even did, remember the picture, it looks quite small, but they offered a bit of deer hunting as well if you could afford it. So they must have let a poor old deer out into the ground, and a bit of fishing and shooting duck. Yeah. You don't get that in athletic stadiums now.
That's terrific.
Thank you.
Well done.